Ray didn't mean to become the sort of person who posted an ad reading cheap room. Omega friendly. Slight chaos. Must like plants. He'd been desperate. Rent prices in the city were a slow-moving horror movie, and his salary was the kind of thing you mentally apologized to when signing a check. He expected another exhausted 9-to-5er. Someone who microwaved soup at midnight and judged traffic like an old friend. Not a polite college kid who had the decency to knock twice. Jaylon had shown up with a cardboard box, a careful smile, and an apology about the shoes. He was 21 in the way people talk about youth, with a soft edge. Limbs still learning to trust themselves. Eyes both cautious and curious. Ray realized then he'd not only rented a room, he'd rented a live wire. 2 months in, Ray had learned 3 things. Jaylon made everything look tidy by existing, the kid could cook actual edible food from ramen packages, and the universe loved humiliating Ray in high definition. Every oops in the apartment seemed accessorized with Jaylon. He tripped over the laundry basket and landed against Jaylon, exposing a faded omega mark. Jaylon's face went flush and quiet. Ray, being Ray, laughed. Because what else do you do when your dignity is briefly stolen by poor balance? You okay? Jaylon had whispered, like it was a secret between 2 conspirators and not Ray's complete life. Fine, Ray said, eyes on his knees. Just practicing new cardio. Now they shared a couch, a fridge, and a passive-aggressive plant Ray had named Phil. Jaylon came in sometimes carrying extra coffees for no reason, and Ray learned to pretend his heart wasn't doing a sloppy samba every time the kid's hoodie caught on the doorknob. He also learned that it was very easy to say mean things as a defense mechanism. You're old for an omega, Ray joked the second week. When Jaylon's bedroom light stayed on too late, and he made a face at every late-night pizza ad. You should be nestling, not CR. Jaylon blinked. You sound pleased, he said dry. Ray grinned like a man who'd spent too much time alone. Of course, someone's gotta be the unwanted artifact in the relationship. Jaylon smiled, small and dangerous. I don't think you're unwanted. Ray nearly choked on his pride. Jaylon was quietly dangerous in the way that he noticed small things. The scatter of Ray's keys, the mug Ray always used on Thursdays when he had a presentation, the way Ray's laugh became sharper when he was embarrassed. Ray noticed too, probably more than he wanted to admit, but he wore sarcasm like armor. It fit better than the thrift store coats he favored. A rainy Wednesday found Jaylon under the sink with his sleeve rolled up, tools clinking, and Ray standing uselessly with a towel. He offered a wrench like a man offering a tiny truce. Ray looked at the wrench at Jaylon's elbow, at the way his shirt lifted a little when he reached. A flash of wrist, a hint of skin where his T rose. Ray fumbled the wrench as if gravity were conspiring. Careful, Jaylon said softly from the dim. You'll drop it. Ray almost did. I'm fine. Performing precarious domestic feats is my brand. Right, Jaylon said. When he straightened, there was an annoyingly contained smile on his face. They ate instant noodles on the kitchen floor after, a small ritual for days when both were too tired for the couch. Jaylon's hand brushed Ray's twice. Both times, Ray's chest did a thing he didn't like the name of. He joked to keep the air thin. Keep this up and people will think you're into your old roommate, Ray said, joking about the past with a laugh that tried to be airy. Jaylon's mouth made a soft curve. Do you think I am? I think you're dangerous with a wrench, Ray lied, because it felt safer than admitting his chest had been dumb for reasons not worth admitting. Jaylon just smiled then, the kind of smile that meant the world could shift without a single facade cracking. It was that foul, sticky heat of late July when the AC collapses into a heap and the whole city smells like a pressure cooker. The apartment's ancient system gave up with a theatrical sigh. The result was 2 humans and 1 plant slowly wilting. Ray wore the loosest tank top in existence and practiced the art of looking as unbothered as possible. Jaylon walked around like a concerned weather report. You look like you're melting, Jaylon observed, handing Ray a fan he'd stolen from the hallway closet. Melting is in vogue, Ray replied, taking the fan like a cape. I call this look drowning omega, too tired to care. Jaylon chuckled, the sound like a little bell. He sipped water. Ray felt ridiculous noticing the angle of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught the corner of his nose. Ray rolled his eyes at himself. It was pathetic. He was an adult with bills and a plant named Phil who depended on him. He shouldn't be replaying a graduate thesis on why Jaylon's freckles were unfair. One tiny drop of sweat rolled down Ray's neck. For some ungodly reason Jaylon's gaze followed the drop. He blinked quick, as if apologizing to himself for being a human. Ray tried to be irritated. "Eyes up, kid." "Sorry," Jaylon said too fast. And there it was, a pink on his ears that Ray could swear melted a little of his sarcasm. Late that night, the air finally cooled and the two of them lay on opposite sides of the couch like tectonic plates, too close for comfort and too far for safety. Ray listened to the sounds of Jaylon's quiet breathing and recognized that missing someone could taste like a heavy sweet. He shoved that thought away with a joke about being dramatic and old. But the joke didn't land. Neither of them had to say they were aware. It was that foul, sticky heat of late July when the AC collapses into a heap and the whole city smells like a pressure cooker. The apartment's ancient system gave up with a theatrical sigh. The result was two humans and one plant slowly wilting. Ray wore the loosest tank top in existence and practiced the art of looking as unbothered as possible. Jaylon walked around like a concerned weather report. "You look like you're melting," Jaylon observed, handing Ray a fan he'd stolen from the hallway closet. "Melting is in vogue," Ray replied, taking the fan like a cape. "I call this look drowning Omega. Too tired to care." Jaylon chuckled, the sound like a little bell. He sipped water. Ray felt ridiculous noticing the angle of his jaw, the way the sunlight caught the corner of his nose. Ray rolled his eyes at himself. It was pathetic. He was an adult with bills and a plant named Phil who depended on him. He shouldn't be replaying a graduate thesis on why Jaylon's freckles were unfair. One tiny drop of sweat rolled down Ray's neck. For some ungodly reason Jaylon's gaze followed the drop. He blinked quick, as if apologizing to himself for being a human. Ray tried to be irritated. "Eyes up, kid." "Sorry," Jaylon said too fast. And there it was, a pink on his ears that Ray could swear melted a little of his sarcasm. Late that night, the air finally cooled and the two of them lay on opposite sides of the couch like tectonic plates, too close for comfort and too far for safety. Ray listened to the sounds of Jaylon's quiet breathing and recognized that missing someone could taste like a heavy sweet. He shoved that thought away with a joke about being dramatic and old. But the joke didn't land. Neither of them had to say they were aware. Mika, Ray's coworker and most exhausting meddler, came with ideas that were terrible and often effective. "You're too polite," she declared across the cafe. 2 espresso shots and a symmetry of eyebrows later, she leaned in. "You have to make him jealous. It's the oldest trick in the book." Ray barked a laugh, then remembered everything he'd felt the last week. The look when Jaylon watched another guy hand Ray a coffee, the small, almost invisible tightening around the kid's mouth. Rage at himself pulsed existence. He staged nothing cinematic. He bought flowers from a corner stall and left them on the kitchen table as though they had appeared by accident. He hummed through the apartment, texted Mika nonsense, flirted with the delivery guy because the absurdity of it felt like armor. Jaylon watched. Jaylon continued to be clean and composed. Even the way his jaw clenched looked carefully measured. Then there were the changes. Jaylon offered to take over dish duty for a week. He cooked extra portions and left them with a small note. "Eat this so you don't work too late." He hovered where he previously melded into the background. He watched Mika. Once, a glare rapid enough to be missed if you weren't looking. It was not good for Ray's fragile ego. He'd set the trap. He hadn't expected to be the one caught. Finally, Ray cornered Jaylon by the fridge as Jaylon laid down protectively over leftovers. "You watching me like that or orbiting a possibility I didn't grant?" Jaylon looked up, eyes too earnest to be satire. "Watching someone else give you flowers makes me feel stupid things." Ray's heart tried for the ribcage's exit. "Stupid like wanting to be the one who gets to," Jaylon said. It was small and massive and possibly irreversible. Ray had always been good at pushing people away with jokes. He'd built a fortress of biting remarks and deadpan. This kid, with his soft arrogance and impossible chores, had slipped right into the hallways and left footprints. For 2 days after that, the apartment felt like a house full of unannounced guests. Silent, taut, and impossible to live in. Jaylon moved through rooms with caution. Ray retreated into a shell of bristly jokes. He told himself he was protecting Jaylon. He also told himself he was protecting himself, which was a lie he could live with. Ray started setting out 2 mugs of coffee automatically in the mornings because routine made the edges less sharp. On the second morning, Jaylon's hand brushed his and Ray felt it like static. He spent at least an hour that day stewing about nothing in particular. It felt like a profession. The guilt was a steady drip. One afternoon Ray found Jaylon's mug with a post-it stuck on it. "You said you like it sweet." Ray stared until the words swam. He drank the coffee cold because drinking it warm felt like surrender. He told himself he was better than that. Then rain happened. It always did. Ray was late from work, soaked through, and a little more raw than was reasonable. Jaylon stood in the hall, jacket clinging to him like a second skin. The sight of him, blades of water sticking to his eyelashes, pried something open in Ray he'd kept nailed shut. "You didn't text," Jaylon said, voice taut. "You're not my keeper," Ray snapped, the words tasting like old resentment. The apartment held its breath. Jaylon's eyes were wet, not with rain. "You always say you're unwanted," Jaylon said. "It wasn't an accusation so much as an observation. You use it like permission to act like you don't care. But you hurt people when you do that." Ray staggered like he'd been struck. "I don't want you catching feelings you'll later regret," he said, which was essentially a panicked confession and a cowardly lie wrapped together. Jaylon's face shifted. "Maybe I already did." The door slammed before anything more could be said. Silence is its own kind of noise. The apartment filled with it, and it was loud enough to rattle the plates. Jaylon's door stayed closed more than usual. The couch seemed like a relic rather than a shared space. Ray kept busy with projects, invoices, and arguments with the washing machine. He told Mika he was thriving, which was the closest he had to a consistent answer for everything life threw at him now. But thriving had cracks. Late nights left him more hollow than usual. He caught himself listening for the pattern of Jaylon's steps and felt the absence of them like a missing song. Every time he reached for his phone to text a stupid joke or a recipe, his thumb hesitated. One evening, in the middle of washing a bowl, he paused because the apartment was too quiet and realized he didn't like the taste of quiet. He wanted the clatter of Jaylon's textbooks, the smell of his hoodie when it lay on the couch. He wanted the clumsy, ordinary things he'd insisted he didn't need. He picked up Jaylon's mug, thumb rubbed the chipped rim. The world felt absurdly thin without the kid in it. He whispered to the empty kitchen, "I miss you, you idiot." The words felt like surrender and truth. They also felt like a small, dangerous hope. A week later Jaylon came home with a backpack that looked like it had seen too many late-night study sessions. He set it down and looked at Ray like he'd been holding his breath for days. Eyes tired, hair disheveled, and somehow less guarded than before. "Hey," Jaylon said small. "You're back," Ray said, which had the air of an accusation and a relief rolled into one. Jaylon shrugged. "Dorm's bed is horrifying. My bunkmate snores like a phased engine. I couldn't sleep." Ray's laugh cracked. "That's your reason?" Jaylon smiled half-heartedly. "Would you prefer the truth?" "Hit me," Ray said because he was tired of dressing words in sarcasm. "I missed you," Jaylon said, and it was bare and simple and the sound of the apartment cracking open. Ray's mouth did something stupid. He tried to joke it into a thing that could be controlled. That's what people in rom-coms say before someone trips on the stairs. Jaylon stepped closer until their shoulders almost touched. "This is not a rom-com," he said. "This is real life. And you make me feel things. Things." That small monosyllable held a universe. Ray was a man who had learned to map his feelings in sarcastic comments and rationalization. This kid was building a map he could not read from the inside. Ray wanted to protect them both by running. He also wanted to hold them both in the same breath, and that possibility killed him with its audacity. "Stop looking at me like I'm an afternoon hostage," Ray said, because he couldn't say the better things. Kid, you know I'm complicated. I don't care, Jaylon answered. And there it was. Irresponsible, reckless, and exactly what Ray needed and feared. They drifted back into an uneasy truce. Dinners resumed. Jaylon left a book Ray had remarked on next to the couch. Ray dropped his laundry in the basket instead of the hallway. Things returned to a new normal. One full of small domestic tenderness and raw edges. But jealousy is a patient animal. Small sparks kept flaring. Ray noticed how Jaylon watched other people, with interest, yes, but also a tracking protectiveness that irritated him more than it should. When Jaylon laughed at a classmate's joke on a video call, Ray felt a small, sharp prickle of grievance. He'd do the same thing to someone else and walk away. But with this kid, the feeling braided into something more tender and more dangerous. One evening, Ray took Mika's advice to test the water in a different way. He kissed someone at the office party. It was a silly, exaggerated thing. A goodnight peck on the cheek of a coworker who'd been flirting obnoxiously. He came home with cheeks warm for the wrong reasons and found the apartment darker and Jaylon sitting with a book, watching the doorway like a sentry. Jaylon didn't move. You really did that? Jaylon asked. Ray shrugged. It was nothing. Okay. Jaylon's jaw set. Fine. Ray wanted to laugh at how pathetic both of them were. He wanted to yank his own heart out. He wanted to apologize. Instead, he turned to find Jaylon's expression folded in ways that felt like accusation and pain. The kid retreated to his room that night softer than usual, and Ray realized he'd become the living reason Jaylon was small and careful. He hated himself for it. Ray's self-sabotage culminated on a Thursday so ordinary it hurt. He'd had a bad day at work. A client's temper had made him relive feelings he thought he'd long since bricked over. He came home and found Jaylon cooking, faux simmering, steam fogging the kitchen window. Phil the plant had a new baby leaf and the apartment, for a heartbeat, looked like a postcard for domestic peace. Instead, Ray snapped. He sniped about Jaylon's schedule, mocked his study habits, said something cruel about being young and disposable. He swore he was trying to push Jaylon away so he wouldn't get hurt by whatever inevitable decision Ray would make one day to split before things got messy. It made sense to him in a sad, circular way. Jaylon stopped stirring. He looked at Ray like a person considering unstickable glue. You always assume you'll be the reason someone leaves, Jaylon said. Maybe you're wrong. Ray felt the floor tilt. And maybe you're a naive college kid who will realize you deserve someone better. You keep saying that like it's a kindness, Jaylon spat, voice trembling. Like I deserve a well-packaged good decision. Ray swallowed. I don't want you to. He couldn't finish. You don't get to decide for me. Jaylon's voice rose. You don't get to condemn me to regret before I even breathe. The argument felt like old hands pulling at an old wound. Words were flung, each one a little shard. When Jaylon slammed his door, the sound inside Ray's head had a sharp finality. He realized then he had pushed so hard, he might have broken the fragile thing he'd been terrified to hold. 2 days of silence followed like a punishment. Ray slept badly, nightmares of Jaylon packing boxes and leaving. He spent hours crafting text messages and deleting them. He promised himself he'd become a man who apologized elegantly and with timing, but every attempt at contrition came out tinny and false. He was afraid to call because the sound of his own voice was a reminder of the things he'd said in anger. Instead, he wrote. He wrote long, clumsy notes to Jaylon and left them where the kid might find them. On the bathroom mirror, tucked under a bowl, pinned to Phil's pot. None of them felt good enough. He wanted to explain years of being bruised, of how unwanted was an armor forged from bad childhood narratives and cruel exes. He wanted to tell Jaylon it wasn't true, or rather, that the truth had become something different since Jaylon arrived. Jaylon read none of them for 2 days. Ray's patience frayed. He grew small and bitter, full of regret and hopeless grand gestures that never quite manifested. He imagined Jaylon alone in his room, face hurt and resolute. On the 3rd morning there was an envelope slid under his door, handwriting neat and careful. Inside was a single sticky note. Can you come out? We need to talk and I'm bad at doors. Ray almost laughed at the mess. He went out. They sat at the table that had seen their awkwardness morph into something resembling routine. Jaylon looked at Ray like he was measuring the distance between apology and admission. The air hummed with tension and the hum of the kettle. "I'm sorry," Ray said first, which felt like a small miracle. "For everything. For being cowardly and for pretending I had it all figured out when I was terrified." Jaylon's mouth tightened. "There are parts of you keep hidden and they hurt whoever's there. You say unwanted like it's a fact. That makes me feel like I have to beg for permission to exist with you." Ray winced. "I thought if I rejected first, no one else would get to hurt me." "Did it work?" Jaylon asked softly. "No," Ray admitted. "It just made me really good at being alone. Until you." Jaylon's shoulders lowered a fraction. "I don't want to be someone you rescue. I want to be someone you choose." Ray said the words before he could overthink them. "I do choose you." The sentence was small and jagged but honest. They lived minutes like fragile artifacts then, each one salvaging a little more ground. Jaylon reached across the table and touched Ray's hand, fingers tentative. The contact was electric and ordinary all at once. "You make me feel human," Jaylon whispered. Ray choked on the compliment and the admission. "Don't make me say the things I'll never forgive myself for later," he begged, unsure whether he meant it as a tease or a prayer. "Say them," Jaylon said. So Ray did, in half laughter and worse, in truths that were bleeding and funny. He told Jaylon he'd liked him from the first moment the kid showed up with the cardboard box and a polite, "Sorry about the shoes." He told him he was an exhausting, nostalgic idiot who was suddenly small for the things that mattered, and that he was terrified he'd ruin what they might have. When he finished, both of them were quiet, because there are words that make you tired and words that fix things. That night, the city lights spilled in and painted the kitchen in the honeyed light of coming dusk. They took turns making instant coffee like it was a ritual of reconciliation. The way Jaylon moved was softer than it had been all week. Ray felt the tension drained, leaving behind a raw, ready ache. They stepped onto the balcony. The breeze was forgiving and modest, not conspiratorial. Jaylon wrapped a hoodie around him because the apartment was still the apartment and he wanted a thing to wear. "I thought about leaving," Jaylon said quietly. "Why?" "Because I was afraid you'd never choose me." He paused. "But then I thought maybe I should stop being afraid about everything just because you are." Ray's chest hurt with a specific kind of good pain. He reached out and tucked a damp curl behind Jaylon's ear without thinking. The gesture was simple and intimate. Jaylon leaned in, eyes questioning. "Stop testing me. Don't make me beg," Ray said, half-smile, because he couldn't help it. They hovered on the verge of something one of them might call a kiss and the other might call a promise. For the first time, Ray let himself actually imagine the future, small, clumsy domesticities full of awkward dinners and half-finished books. Felt absurd and miraculous. They didn't kiss, not that night. They stood with their foreheads touching instead, breathing each other in. Whatever came next felt possible. Lucky lewd is what Ray called the universe's terrible sense of humor. The ridiculous, mortifying moments that always seemed to find him and choose Jaylon as co-star. There were too many to count. Falling down the stairs and colliding with Jaylon in the lobby. Jaylon catching Ray in a compromising stretching pose when his shirt slipped. A laundry room incident that resulted in both of them smelling like soap and embarrassment. Jaylon learned to laugh at the calamities. Ray learned to be less defensive about them. But one week the universe served them a particularly humiliating plate. Ray's office had arranged a volunteer day at a local bookstore, and his coworker, who liked to flirt and make sloppy jokes, insisted Ray let him introduce him to someone interesting. Ray, tired and looking for validation he'd never asked for, let it happen. The coworker began to rib Ray about his mature tastes. Then, with an outrageously theatrical wink, pulled a book over Ray's head. Ray laughed weakly, playing along because misdirection was his specialty. Jaylon showed up at the shop 2 minutes later, offered a ridiculous, "I'll protect this Omega" glare. And then, because the world loved bad timing, a shelf above them collapsed. Ray ducked. Paperback hit Jaylon's head. The coworker ended up on the floor. There was dust and giggling, and Jaylon's face turned the spectacular color of mortification. He touched his head and then reached for Ray, where both of them stood dripping in bookstore dust like an oddly formed sacrament. Later, back home, the two of them laughed until they cried. Being embarrassed together had become another way of being close. Jaylon's hand found Ray's and held on just a fraction longer than necessary, and that fraction made Ray's ribs ache in the best possible way. Time has a way of corralling feelings into a parade of small tests. 10 little moments stacked against each other to prove whether two people are flexible enough for the friction of real life. They included the kids staying up till 2 a.m. to help Ray search for a lost document. The time Ray pushed Jaylon to go on a date and then monitored for jealousy like a defensive military operation. And the day they sat in the emergency room waiting room because Jaylon had cut his hand, and then pretended it was nothing. Every test taught them the subtle art of making room. Jaylon learned that Ray's sarcasm was often armor and that there were hidden soft points. Grocery lists, old vinyl records, the plant fill. Ray learned that Jaylon's quiet wasn't apathy, and that anger was a rare bloom in a kid who mostly processed the world internally. On a Tuesday that smelled like rain and paper, Jaylon invited Ray to an open mic night near campus. Ray almost refused. Public vulnerability was not on his CV. But Jaylon's hopeful face was persuasive in a way that made Ray want to be the better man. Jaylon recited a short, clumsy poem about quiet apartments and rescue missions. Ray's chest hurt so much he had to leave the room because tears were indecorous and unprofessional. But Jaylon followed him out and wrapped his arm around him like a coat. "I wrote that for you," Jaylon said, voice small. "Not in a watch-me-be-romantic way, just because I wanted you to know someone was really paying attention." Ray's laugh was broken into parts. "You do too much for a man who claims he's just a college kid." "Do less then," Jaylon said. "Or I'll do more. Your choice." The problem with human motility is that people interpret motion differently. Jaylon had a friend, Kiri, from a film class who was loud, brilliant, and habitually affectionately touchy. Ray had met her and liked her well enough. She was brash in a way that made everyone else feel safe. One afternoon, Kiri joined them for dinner, and the three of them sprawled on the couch watching terrible late-night television. She propped her feet on Ray's knee and called him an old softy, in a voice that made him laugh. After she left, Jaylon sat very still. He wasn't angry, not exactly, but there was a new cautiousness to his movement. "Do you like Kiri?" he asked. "Like her?" Ray blinked. "She's fine. You're weird for being concerned." Jaylon's face folded. I saw her be touchy." Ray wanted to laugh. He shouldn't have felt anything at all. He was a man who had built his entire identity on being the undesirable, the self-protective curmudgeon. But he realized he hated the idea of Jaylon looking at anyone else the way he did. It was a small, ugly, honest thing. He decided then he didn't want to be the man who encouraged Jaylon to spread himself thin. "Stop being jealous," he told Jaylon, then immediately regretted the phrase like a burnt tongue. "That's not what I meant. Look, Kiri is Kiri. She's loud and hugs people," he added, lame and defensive. Jaylon's mouth quirked. "And you're scared I'll prefer loud people?" "No," Ray said too quickly. "I'm scared you'll realize you deserve better than me." "You don't get to decide that either," Jaylon snapped gently. "We're terrible at negotiating feelings." He reached out and squeezed Ray's hand. "But I'm not going anywhere." There came the night when everything threatened to unravel. Ray had an argument with his boss, one that left him feeling small and incompetent. He came home with the weight of expectation heavier than usual and found Jaylon half asleep on the couch with a stack of notes and a mug of cold tea. Ray sat down and, without thinking, started to unload the workday wreckage. He'd barely started before Jaylon interrupted him with a clarity that stunned Ray. "You're not your job," Jaylon said. "You're not the angry client or the mistake. You're the man who waters Phil and who makes me laugh, usually by accident. You are not the worst things that happened to you." Ray blinked. The confession rose in him like a tide. He said terrible things, apologies and confessions and the sort of clumsy half-sentences people use when they mean to be honest. Jaylon listened, and when he replied, he did not speak in platitudes but in specifics. "I like how you always get sad songs stuck in your head and hum them at 3 a.m. I like how you keep tea bags in a little jar next to the couch. I like that you steal my hoodies sometimes and smell like cocoa." Ray laughed through tears. I smell like body heat and lease agreements. You smell like home, Jaylon said. It was a ridiculous phrase, and yet it settled like a hand around Ray's ribcage. That night they fell asleep on the couch, limbs tangled like someone had attempted to knit them together. They had to deal with consequences. Being honest was not a panacea. There were still bad days and moments where Ray's sarcasm snapped like a brittle branch. There were also afternoons where Jaylon's study stress had him brittle, withdrawn, and Ray didn't know how to offer the kind right words. They stumbled and learned and fought with the steadiness of people who cared enough to keep trying. Then there was the day the landlord announced a rent increase. Money, an unforgiving beast, reared its head. Ray did the math in the kitchen and felt the familiar cold of fear. The image of Jaylon packing a cardboard box returned like a recurring nightmare. Jaylon watched from the doorway, face closed. "We can find another place," Jaylon said, voice thin. "Not everyone wants to move twice a year," Ray said. "My job. I'll help," Jaylon insisted. "I can pick up a shift this semester. I can find tutoring work. We can make it work." The offer wasn't naive. It was practical and honest and the sort of thing that meant a person was willing to change their life for you. Ray looked at the kid and saw not just possibility but willing labor. His chest tightened in gratitude and an unnamed fear. He said yes before he had time to overthink it. They renewed the lease together. They also renewed a more fragile and real thing between them, trust. It was not fireworks or a dramatic confession on a midnight train. It was folded sheets and grocery lists and a carefully curated playlist Jaylon made of songs that reminded him of Ray without telling Ray outright. They continued to be annoying for each other in ways that felt like home. Ray made jokes he didn't mean. Jaylon slapped his arm affectionately. They irritated each other daily and loved each other in a long, patient way. One late night, when the rain made the city into a soft wash of lights, Jaylon set a small sticky note on the fridge that said, "Stop calling yourself unwanted. I already marked you mine." Ray laughed and felt a warmth that was more honest than pleasure. He knew the world could still be mean, that being together did not mean protection from the inevitable hurts. But for the first time in a very long time, he wanted to try putting his whole self forward. "Roommates?" Jaylon asked later, voice cautious. "For life," Ray said, eyes on the ceiling, hopeful and foolish and very, very tired. Jaylon grinned. "For life." They did not solve everything. They did not become perfect. But they became a team, messy and fragile and fiercely committed. Ray learned to ask for help. Jaylon learned to say no and to demand better when needed. They kept Phil alive and started planning a small bookshelf for their mismatched novels. Months passed. The apartment hummed with the ordinary. Ray's aloofness softened into something that looked suspiciously like contentment. Jaylon graduated his semester with stress and triumph, and Ray pinned a ridiculous party hat to his head in celebration. Kiri still hugged people with wild abandon. Mika still meddled, but now into affairs of a different kind, sending them care packages and unsolicited baking advice. On a slow Sunday, Ray found Jaylon curled on the couch with a half-finished sketchbook. "What are you doing?" Ray asked. "Drawing us," Jaylon said, not looking up. "I wanted to see how I remember things." Ray moved closer. The drawing was clumsy and beautiful. Two figures with imperfect angles and a plant with an enormous personality. He felt that tug again. The same one that had been there since the cardboard box, only steadier. "So," Jaylon said, eyes bright, "you still planning on calling yourself unwanted?" Ray shrugged. "Guess not. The lease says I'm stuck. Might as well be stuck with the right person." They kissed finally in a small, lazy peck that turned into something a little longer, soft and unfussy. It wasn't the kind of premiere that warranted fireworks. It was a kitchen floor, hand-in-hand kind of ceiling. They'd earned it through laundry and arguments and innumerable tiny moments of choosing. Later, Phil had a new baby leaf and the apartment felt very warm. Ray sighed. "Full and ridiculous." "I swear your stubbornness is a virtue." Jaylon grinned, teeth flashing. "And your sarcasm is a hobby I'll tolerate." They laughed. Then they dug in a box and pulled out a battered takeout menu because neither of them could cook when they wanted to celebrate properly. The city hummed outside like an audience. The apartment was small, a little chaotic and wholly their own. It wasn't perfect. It was ours.